Thank you. Hello, you can hear me? Okay. This is a big challenge, of course, to gallop in 25 minutes throughout a century. And I will try to give you an outline of the emergence and development of an international peace movement during its first 100 years. Since English is not my mother tongue and I haven't spoken it for a long time, I will follow a written guideline in order to finish the job in the short time I have. I will also give some background by a few slides which give you some information about names, organizations, and so on. The first peace organizations emerged in America and Britain. This was no coincidence. While on the European continent, after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Restoration took over, there were evolving democracies in the Anglo-Saxon countries and a kind of peace tradition, as for example carried by the Quakers, who renounced any kind of war. For those early societies, the question if a war could be defensive and therefore justified was from the beginning a thorny one. The New York Peace Society. Oh, sorry. Why doesn't it move? Okay. The New York Peace Society, founded in 1815 by merchant David Lodge, followed a fundamental pacifism, rejecting all kinds of war. While the Massachusetts Peace Society, its founder was Unitarian Minister Noah Worcester, gathered both fundamental pacifists and those who accepted strictly defensive wars. With about 50 other groups, both organizations merged to become the American Peace Society in 1828. The London Peace Society had an interesting top-tier approach. Its leadership had to pursue a fundamental pacifist cause, while the ordinary members were allowed to have different ideas about defensive wars. On the European continent, some short-lived peace organizations emerged only later. The formation of those first peace societies occurred under the influence of Quakers, one of the three historic peace churches which renounced violence, and of Christians who were convinced that war was murderous and incompatible with Christian values. But there were worldview arguments too. War is an outdated model for settling international differences. It is in conflict with reason and impedes the progress of mankind. War destroys property, thus doing harm to the prosperous class, but it also inflicts much greater hardship on the poor who do most of the fighting and finally pay the cost of war. War is a waste of man's resources. Politically, war and militarism cripple civil liberties, and there was a biological argument. War killed the young and healthy, the flower of the human race. So in Nuth there were already many of the arguments which were elaborated later. The peace movement of the 19th century was essentially a movement of men from the middle classes. Women played a greater role only in the years before World War I. Typical professions were clergy, physician, merchant, or teacher. Pacifists were part of an awakened bourgeois society which claimed participation in politics and societal issues. They saw themselves as a part of a broader movement for social reform, which ultimately would prevail. The belief in unstoppable human progress culminated in the decades before World War I. Pacifists tried to inform and influence public opinion and to be heard by those in power. The means they used were the typical ones of bourgeois citizens: lecturing, debating in small circles, publishing leaflets, booklets, monthly and annual journals, offering prizes for essay competition on modes of achieving peace, tabling petitions and lobbying editors, members of parliament, and government. During the 1899 Hague Peace Conference, prominent pacifists, among them Bertha von Suttner, lobbied diplomats in privately organized evening salons. It was the first time that a kind of civil society tried to influence an official state conference. Some delegates promptly complained. Financially, the movement was always weak, though occasionally it got support by some bankers and industrial tycoons like Andrew Carnegie later. From 1843 to 1853, the first series of international peace congresses took place, visited mostly by American and British and a few European peace friends. The London Congress occurred in the context of the anti-slavery movement. William Lloyd Garrison had founded the New England Non-Resistance Society in 1838 as an anarcho-pacifist organization renouncing civil government altogether. Activists, including women like Quaker Lucretia Mott, practiced civilian disobedience, boycott of slave-made goods, sit-ins in railway cars, walk-alongs in the street, black and white, arm in arm. In the last decades of the century, followers of Russian writer Leo Tolstoy propagated a Christian anarcho-pacifism. They gained some influence mainly in Britain, France, and the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, there developed also a socialist-motivated nonviolent anarchism after 1900. The 1848 Congress and the following ones were supported by the movement for free trade, which had more resources than pacifists. English manufacturer Richard Cobden argued that free trade would create economic interdependence and thus lead to lasting peace. Cobden also promoted arbitration and disarmament and an international exchange of people. This was also an issue for the learned blacksmith Elihu Burritt, who was mainly responsible for the organization of the congresses. Burritt established the League for Universal Brotherhood in 1847. It was the first international secular peace organization with branches in Britain and the USA and some outreach on the European continent. It aimed at organizing farmers and workers. 50,000 people signed a pledge of abstinence from any kind of war. In 1845, Burritt succeeded in influencing public opinion for a peaceful solution of the Oregon conflict between Britain and the USA by organizing an exchange of friendly letters between English Quakers and American activists, which were published as supplements in mainstream newspapers. Beginning in 1867, a second stage of the establishment of peace organizations set in. The Ligue Internationale de la Paix et de la Liberté was an attempt to gather radical Republicans, socialists from all strands, and national revolutionaries, Garibaldi. It failed because there was no agreement how to define and realize its political and social aims. In the 1880s and 1890s, a whole set of new organizations were founded. They were secular. Most followed the slogan "Peace through Law" and strove mainly for the establishment of an international order based on law. Politically, they leaned against liberal parties. Some prominent pacifists were liberal parliamentarians, for example, Frédéric Baillet, Denmark, later president of the International Peace Bureau, but also socialist deputies like Henri Lafontaine from Belgium supported those efforts. In 1889, French pacifist Frédéric Passy founded with English labor organizer William Randall Kramer the Interparliamentary Union, which focused its work on arbitration and debated the idea of neutralizing larger parts of Europe. In 1889, also a new series of universal peace congresses began. At the Third Congress, 1891 in Rome, it was decided to create the Permanent International Peace Bureau as the executive office of the International Union of Peace Societies. The IPB became an umbrella for the whole pacifist movement. Fundamental pacifists, as well as peace through law adherents, and some anti-militarists joined. The IPB became responsible for organizing the Universal Peace Congresses. It published a bi-monthly journal and tried with limited success to coordinate pacifist activities. Though the Bureau got yearly subsidies from Denmark, Sweden, and Switzerland, it was located in Bern, its financial and human resources remained weak. In 1905, it claimed 132 member organizations from 26 countries. In the beginnings, the peace congresses were held in conjunction with the meetings of the IPU. Later, many interparliamentarians shied away from too close a neighborhood to the pacifists. If possible, the congresses were held at places where a world fair took place. Pacifists wanted to show that they were part of the progress exhibited at those fairs. In the 2 decades before 1914, there was an enormous optimism that the civilized world was on its way for global peace and cooperation, despite growing international tensions, rising militarism and armaments, and an increasing number of military conflicts. Growing economic and technical international cooperation and increasing personal exchange among people via telecommunication and new means of transport seemed to result in an internationalization of the world. Especially Austrian pacifist Alfred Hermann Fried believed this would naturally lead to an international system based on law and thus overcome the current state of international anarchy, which provided not more than a truce among states between periods of war. Fried discussed methods of mediation and fact-finding commissions as a means to calm down nationalist emotions. The optimism of European pacifists was further spurred by the remarkable rise of the peace movement in the United States. About 50 new peace organizations were founded till 1914. Their leaders came from the business and professional world and followed an elitist approach of enlightened leadership. The international reforms they strove for had to come from above rather than from below. Soft pedaling the armaments question, some simultaneously had prominent positions in the military preparedness organizations. What European pacifists ignored was that the cause of peace had become respectable and even somewhat fashionable in the US, but at the cost of deep personal commitment and an honest debate, since even within the movement, existing differences were glossed over. At the peace congresses, arbitration was a major theme. Pacifists developed a graduated scheme beginning with individual arbitration treaties, mounting up to a permanent court of arbitration. But they made reservations. Issues of vital national interests and questions of honor should be excluded. And they could not agree on the thorny questions of sanctions. While some affirmed the use of force against nations which refused to submit their international disputes to arbitration or conciliation, the majority position was that sanctions should be of no military character. Economic sanctions were also seen skeptical because of its detrimental effect on workers. Pacifists did not shake the principle of the sovereignty of states. They conceded states the right to armed defense and regarded defensive wars to be justified. Conscientious objection was rejected by an overwhelming majority. Before World War I, there were a few religiously motivated objectors. An organized political campaign for conscientious objection was carried only by Norwegian and Swedish socialist youth groups. Gaston Mosch, a French former artillery captain, campaigned constantly for a popular militia composed of all able-bodied males trained from the schoolyard up as a democratic, inexpensive, and truly defensive means. This resembled the ideas socialist leaders August Bebel and Georges Auré had. The 18th Universal Peace Congress, 1910, in Stockholm, adopted a peace code, Code de la Paix, consisting of 145 articles. The code was the most thoroughgoing statements of human rights devised since the peace movement had begun. It admitted no distinction between the morality of the individual and the state. Nations had no more right to create their own morality than did individuals. And the code declares these principles applicable across the globe, including the colonies, though the attitude towards the indigenous people remained paternalistic. The relationship between the peace movement and the workers' movement was a difficult one. Elihu Burritt, you remember 1847, League of Universal Brotherhood, at once pondered to call workers to strike against war. In 1870, Randall Kramer founded in Britain the Workmen's Peace Association. But many pacifists held conservative views in social terms, though arguing that a reduction of arms would free resources to improve the life of workers. They took the issue not really serious. On the other side, the position of the Socialist International was for a long time that war was an inevitable result of capitalism and that only after a socialist revolution lasting peace could be achieved. Only in the decade before World War I, a mutual rapprochement took place. At the Universal Peace Congresses, it was conceded that there existed economic roots of war and colonialism, and that social reform for the benefit of workers was needed. Pacifists insisted, however, that abolishing capitalism didn't result automatically in the elimination of war. On the other side, the Socialist International now endorsed arbitration as a means to settle international conflict and encouraged its parliamentarians to join the IPU. A considerable number of smaller trade unions and cooperatives joined the IPB. 10,000 workers participated in a joint rally with prominent socialist speakers on occasion of the Universal Peace Congress 1908 in London. In 1913, the IPB was mainly responsible for organizing in Bern a conference of German and French deputies who stressed the necessity of a peaceful settlement of the serious conflicts between the two nations. On the German side, only Social Democrats participate. Only in the decade before World War I, the IPB issued statements on current conflict and issues. In 1911, this led to a break with the Italian pacifists because the IPB condemned Italy's attack on the Ottoman Empire about Libya. Also, demands for arms reduction and disarmament, which had been overshadowed by the arbitration issue, became more prominent. This was partly due to the voices of women, who now joined the movement in greater numbers. Bertha von Suttner, with her groundbreaking novel, Lay Down Your Arms, the most prominent one. With careers in social work, teaching, and nursing, women were inclined to connect military spending to persistent poverty and misery in working-class families. Women had played a modest role already in so-called olive leaf circles in England in the 1840s. During the Boer War, during the Boer War, 1899 to 1902, Emily Hobhouse confronted the government and large parts of the public by setting up a relief fund for Boer women and children, which means for people of the enemy side. Eleonore Selenka from Munich launched an appeal in support of the Hague Peace Conference, gathering signatures from more than 1 million women as far as Japan. Socialist women like Clara Zetkin and Rosa Luxemburg denounced militarism and propagated anti-militarist education, but were not ready to cooperate with pacifists and bourgeois feminists. In the last years before World War I, there was a rapprochement between the male-dominated peace congresses and the progressive wing of the feminist suffragist movement. Peace was a major theme at the 1913 Congress of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance in Budapest. In 1898, banker and railway tycoon John de Bloch had published a 6-volume study predicting that a war between the two well-armed alliances in Europe would be suicidal. Detailing the technical revolution of the new weaponry, the dramatic changes in the battlefield, and the implications of a long, stalemated war for the European social order, he farsightedly concluded that the result would be the elimination of European monarchy, vast rivers of blood with no victory, the likelihood of a socialist revolution, and the destruction of Europe's global role. Later, it was Bertha von Suttner who continuously warned against a great European war, for example, 1912 in her booklet, The Barbarization of the Air. Suttner also complained about secret pacts between governments, and that the decision about war and peace was taken by 24 male rulers, an issue which would be taken up again in World War I. But it's also true that many pacifists were too optimistic, believing that the catastrophe eventually would not occur. The start of World War I shocked and paralyzed them. So how far had the movement got in 1914? Visible successes were rare. A few cases in which differences between states had been settled by arbitral award, some examples of citizen diplomacy successfully preventing military conflict, as in the peaceful dissolution of Norway from the enforced union with Sweden against warmongering Swedish circles in 1905, a considerable effect on scholars of international law, the establishment of the Nobel Peace Prize as a symbol of great importance. But the convening of the Hague Peace Conference was a clear sign that the ideas put forward by the peace movement would no longer be dismissed as naive and utopian. And even though war still was almost universally considered an acceptable, perhaps an inevitable, and for some people even a desirable way of settling international differences, pacifists succeeded in creating a minority subculture which challenged this dogma and offered alternatives. Despite its flaws, the movement in its first 100 years had paved the ground. It was now up to the successors to elaborate and hopefully realize alternatives to warfare. Thank you.
Guido, thank you very much for this insightful presentation with so many information. I have to admit that I'm overwhelmed. I just, looking at my notes from the anti-slavery movement with Tolstoy and one of my favorite authors, the Universal Brotherhood, you managed to show us the links between the movement and in its roots and with the women's movement, which is also very important, with the workers, with so many aspects, peaceful law. I'm overwhelmed. Thank you very, very much. Now well, I would like...
I could give you, unfortunately, only a glimpse. This is a problem. Either you get into detail with some things or you just try to get the most important thing. So I'm sorry.
I understand you squeezed a century of time into 20 minutes, and it's stunning. I would like to open the floor to questions and comments. I would like to ask you to keep your comments short, up to 2 minutes, because we would like to give the opportunity to as much as possible for you to ask questions. And I would just like to have a look at the chat part, and I don't see any questions except one comment which says very insightful lecture. So I'm opening the floor to comments and questions, and for now I don't see.
Can I ask question?
Yes, sure.
Yuri Shlazhenko, Executive Secretary of Ukrainian Pacifist Movement. Very interesting comment about Christian anarcho-pacifism of followers of Lev Tolstoy. As I know, we had in Ukraine in 20 years of previous 20th century labor commune Bratsky Trud, fraternal labor, which was a section of War Resisters International. So my question is, can you say more about followers of Leo Tolstoy and maybe particular followers in Ukraine? Thank you.
No, sorry. You must know, even though I have published in the last 35 years quite a few works on the history of peace movements and conscientious objection. I have a main bread and butter job. I run my own business for more than 20 years now as independent financial advisor. So I'm doing my research in my leisure time. And I have a few books here on followers of Tolstoy. I also know there is a new book, which I haven't seen yet, but I couldn't tell you now anything, and especially I don't know, I really don't know, or have a very scarce knowledge on all which happened in the Eastern European countries. Because the problem is Peter Brock was doing a lot. Maybe I can later, I have your email address, I can have a look in his books if he has something on it. But on the other side, I don't know the languages, and in English, not much is published yet about pacifist ideas or the history of peace movements in the Eastern European country or in Russia.
Thank you, Professor. I will write my email to chat.
I have it from the EBSCO list.
Okay. I know that in the book of Devi Prasad, War is a Crime Against Humanity, story of War Resisters International, there is a chapter about followers of Tolstoy. If there are more literature, it would be very interesting. Thank you.
So thank you, Yuri, for your question, and for the follow-up promise for Guido. Any other questions?
I've got a question, if you can hear me.
Yes, Thomas.
Hello. Thank you for your very great talk. I'm thinking in terms of what's going on in America now with the whole crisis they're suffering as a country. And I was fascinated to hear the link between the pacifist movement in America and the anti-slavery movement. You spoke about that. But when the Civil War broke out, they were in a quandary. Was there a pacifist movement that said, no, let's not fight over this. Let's arbitrate, let's end slavery legally. Let's stay pacifists. Or did all the pacifists immediately join up in the Union Army and say we have to defeat it with weapons? Well, I mean, this is a silly question, but were there any Confederate?
No. This is no silly question.
It's a critical issue at the moment, the legacy of this in America. you know, should you do a revolution? What do you do? You know? And I know Marx was in touch with Lincoln. I've just been discovering. Marx wrote on behalf of the International Working Men's Association to support Lincoln and the North. He saw the ending of slavery as a moral duty.
Mm-hmm.
But he wasn't a pacifist. So anyway, were there any pacifists trying to stop the Civil War?
No, I wouldn't say really trying to stop. That would be too much. The established American Peace Society in 1861, if I remember correctly, supported the North. And even among Quakers, they were rather divided. So I can't tell you now about an organization. I can imagine that there was a small organization, but I'm not a specialist, of course, on the history of the US peace movement in the 19th century. But I know there has, of course, been some opposition, but I wouldn't say it was big enough really to stop the war. That is one, resistance in this way. And they were so small that they had no chance to offer mediation.
It's always...
But I'm sure, as I said, sorry, this is, if I would have time, I could look in my books and I could give you a much more detailed answer. Please don't forget that up to 4 days ago, I was still in my economic data. They were in the forefront of my head.
I think Thomas is still okay with the answer.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Guido. I'm looking for other.
I have one.
Petra,
I have one. So.
With Rainer, Petra first, raise her hand.
Yes, I don't know how to raise my hand in this bottom. So
but we saw you, so please.
Guido, hello. Good to see you again after 2 years. It's Bertha von Suttner's birthday today.
Ah, okay.
We met in The Hague. My question is, I try to understand this arbitration discussion. I know that Ducommun, as president, wrote thousands and thousands of letters asking for arbitration to the powerful of the world. But this was a written legal argumentation. On the other hand, the peace societies and the people who met in the evenings, all these women and grassroots people who came together to discuss peace before the First World War, talking about it, they did not have legal education. How could they demand arbitration? Because this is so technically legal, and I still cannot combine grassroots demands with the private law arbitration demands of higher educated people.
Yeah, that is a problem, I think, which we face today too. Rainer maybe have some experience in this, having worked for the International Lawyers Association. Because, of course, if you call for a peaceful settlement of conflicts in legal or juristic terms, it means that you move to a field where ordinary people, not only peace activists and not only people from the streets, but also maybe educated historians or educated economists don't have any knowledge. And so this is difficult to discuss in detail and to understand. I think that is really a big problem, and maybe one reason why most the debates within the peace movement are among activists, even educated activists, remained somewhat superficial because they were not able to go really to the details. I also, let me add, as somebody who is no lawyer, it also is to some extent a problem because every profession sees how to explain the world in its own terms. the legal profession is not different from this. And a big problem from my point of view is that legal or lawyers tend to, or that the law tends to only have black and white. The many shadows of gray, which constitute your normal life, are often they are overshadowed. Well, my English is not good enough to explain this really.
I think it was enough, Guido. Thank you. Reiner, you were next.
You know, to the former speaker, I think we should see the legal activities and the grassroots activities as two sides of one coin. They have the same goal, but they were trying is with different measures. And this is like today, you know, peace movement is a broad movement and the activities are on different fields. But my question, Guido, is to the relations between the pacifist movement and the workers' peace movement, or the anti-militaristic workers' movement. How do we describe these relations in the beginning of the 19th century? Are these totally independent? Are there overlaps? And where are these overlaps and what they were doing together and where they have their specific single ways?
I think when you think the organized workers movement and also the socialist international really becomes active in the second part of the century. So when we talk about the first part of the century, we have mostly ideas in both movements. And yeah, then I think the on the side of the social internationalists, there was this clear fight and also the division with Marxist pursuit to shut off all other strands of socialism. And then, so this notion of only the socialist revolution can remove and abolish war was dominant till about, one could say, to the Stuttgart conference in 1907. It doesn't mean that in different countries, individual countries, for example, in France, the strand which Jean Jaurès represented was to some kind of reformist one. But he was, of course, very much eager to work for. First, peace was for him an important issue also in capitalist times or in the capitalist society, but he also was eager and ready to approach other movements slowly. This is true, of course, also for Britain, where the Marxian tradition came only developed only later, because the British tradition, the British tradition of socialism was much more pragmatic. And trade unions, of course, within trade unions, there was much more readiness to listen to pacifist arguments as they evolved, as they really took serious the question to reduce armament in order to better the life of the things, because of course trade unions were mostly busy with improving the daily conditions.
Thank you.
So in general, it's a general answer. In detail, it's difficult, but I mean, it is true if you look from the history of idea, it's mostly the reformists or the more pragmatic ones who were ready to accept that within capitalism, you can work with with parts of other classes, and that the bourgeoisie is not a whole reactionary bloc.
Thank
An
you,
early
Guido.
Gorbachev, you could say.
Thank you. I saw Emily's hand, but it's not up there. Do you still want to ask a question, Emily?
Yes, I, because of everything given in the US, have been reading up on the history of policing, and I'm wondering what the connection between the founding of the London police in 1829 is with their suppression of labor movements and pacifists kind of having this divide with labor movements early on in the 19th century is, and if you could speak a little bit to pacifists and their feelings or relationship with police forces.
Sorry, I haven't understood the question.
I'm wondering if if pacifists at the time had any thoughts or opposition to the founding of police forces.
You mean domestic?
Yes, like the London police were founded in 1829.
Okay. I don't know. I mean, I know there was certainly maybe later in the late decades of the century within some fundamental pacifist or at least anarcho-pacifist circles. I'm sure you had some debate about this. I know, for example, that there was a debate of how to deal with criminals and if to put them in prison would really be for the good of society. But these were discussions and very small circles. I couldn't name you now, but I remember slightly that there was something.
Something to dig into it, Emily. I hope that there is at least a path shown to you. I would like to I'll give the floor to Ariel, and this would be then the last question to Guido in this session. Ariel?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Guido. It was very interesting, and it gives me a lot of energy to read more about these so important questions that have been discussed in the past by our colleagues. I wanted to know more. I'm sure you've crossed this question all the time in your discussion, but just to have your opinion about the role of women and how it came up and down during certain periods. So I'm very interested in that. Thank you.
Well, one has to admit that male pacifists were not better than other males in the 19th century. So up to the late century, women were not allowed to speak at peace conferences. We have a few cases where they tried. But this, of course, changed in the late 80s. It was not only Bertha von Suttner, who published her book in 1898, but also quite a few other women who now spoke up, and it was not easy. It depended. For example, in the German Peace Society, they got some ground in the beginning, but it was difficult, and later on, there was even a kind of regression. But I would say beginning from the 1890s, especially after the turn of the century, 1900, then women came to the forefront, and they didn't go away. There was no longer an up and down, but they decided then, because they saw that they had differences, had different approaches. Politically, for example, it really was true that the majority of women was more courageous than quite a few male pacifists in raising directly the question of disarmament, of reduction of arms. There were quite a few male pacifists who tried to let this question be subdued by discussions about arbitration or other things, because they didn't want to confront the governments or to give an excuse for bourgeois conservative parties. At the beginning of the First World War, there was, for example, the Frauenbund of the German Peace Society, and it is no coincidence that within the First World War, women organizations emerged, and the only attempt to have a kind of international understanding, to speak to each another and to call for mediation was done in 1915 by women, the The Hague Conference, which resulted then in the foundation later of the International Women's League for Peace and Freedom. And I think this is no coincidence, even though recent study has shown that they also had quite a lot of quarrels. So it was not our glorious, but certainly they did try to an approach.
Thank you very much, Guido, and thank you, Ariel, for this brilliant question. I'm happy to close now the discussion part and go into another field which starts with a world war. I would like to give over the floor to David Cortright, who will now give us an overview from 1914 to 1949, including both world wars. Please, David.
Okay, thank you. Is the screen share okay?
It is.
Good, good, thank you. Now I can figure out how to advance it, we'll see. So thank you for inviting me, and it's wonderful to be in this conversation with some old dear friends and many new friends, I hope. And thank you, Guido, for the wonderful presentation. I think we first met back in the 70s when we both had more hair than we do now, but I've always appreciated your work and happy to be able to follow up. First, just a few words about myself. As Amela said, I was an activist during the Vietnam War as an active duty soldier. I had the misfortune of graduating from university in 1968 and was immediately drafted to fight in the war. So I took an enlistment to avoid the infantry, but still I had to face the war and the moral objection to such a cruel and unjust war. So I began to speak out on active duty, and this was a poster for which I posed in 1969 that was widely distributed within the anti-war movement, produced by the Student Mobilization Committee at the time. I was very much a part of the broader soldiers movement. This is an image of the GIs for Peace demonstrating in San Francisco in 1968. But there were many thousands of, tens of thousands of active duty service members who opposed the war, and I was certainly a big part of that, that big movement. I was a small part of a big movement, I'll put it that way. And then I got through my enlistment in 1971, and for my PhD dissertation, I wrote this book, Soldiers in Revolt, which is still considered the classic original history of a movement that's very little known in the world and in the United States, the way in which soldiers and veterans spoke out against the war and played, I think, an important role in helping to bring that horrendous conflict to an end. You can see there's a lot of shameless self-promotion going on here of my books, but this is the book upon which I'll base a lot of my remarks here, and as Guido knows it as well, and much of what he was saying was covered a bit in this book as well. So to begin, in terms of discussing the peace and anti-war movements, of course, 1914 was a horrific and horrible blow to everyone. As von Suttner said, she died right before the war began, and said that we had not done enough. We were not able to stem the forces of militarism and imperialism that drove the nations of Europe to, indeed, a kind of collective suicide, as Bloch's book predicted at the turn of the century, or his 6-volume study. But the movement remained active, and right away there was the founding of new peace and pacifist organizations. The Fellowship of Reconciliation came into being in England in December of 1914, working on humanitarian relief, but also on supporting those few brave men who are willing to be conscientious objectors to that war. Conscientious objection then was a very perilous and difficult process, and many were prosecuted, imprisoned. So it was difficult in Europe and then in the United States when America entered the war as well. FOR's branch opened in the US in 1915 and focused on the message of war as being incompatible with true religion, with the principles of Christianity. Other organizations formed in the United States that were less explicitly pacifist but strongly anti-war. The American Union Against Militarism, AUAM, the National Council for the Prevention of War. These were formed in 1915 and 16. It's interesting that the AUAM later became the American Civil Liberties Union, an organization that is still very active and very prominent in the United States today. And that's because those who were speaking out, as I mentioned, against war, against conscription, were savagely attacked in the press, subject to police prosecution and physical force at times. And then, of course, at the end of the war, in 1918 and 1919, in the US, there was a very hardline Red Scare, a revival of right-wing politics, a strong movement against African Americans in the United States, lynching and other forms of terror against especially African Americans who came back from the war as soldiers. So all of this was a major part of the war crisis. The American Friends Service Committee, which Joe Gersten is still part of, a major organization that's been at the heart of all American peace and disarmament campaigns for the last century, was founded at that time as well and focused a lot on humanitarian relief and conscientious objection. So these movements moved and made a difference. Women were very prominent in the efforts to first prevent the war, of course, and then to try to prevent the United States entry. And here we have Jane Addams, who was one of the great women leaders of American life before the war, was at times considered one of the greatest people in America as measured by various polls and press reports. But she was a strong pacifist. She opposed the war. She helped to co-chair the International Congress of Women that met in The Hague in 1915. And out of that came the Women's Peace Party, which later became the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which again is still active today. And Jane Addams was unrepentant and absolute in her commitment to pacifism and opposed US entry into the war and was vilified in the press and attacked. And a person who had been greatly honored and respected as a hero of American life was suddenly considered a radical outsider and was looked down upon. But she remained strong in her convictions and continued to work in humanitarian and social relief in her home city of Chicago. And in Chicago, those of you who visit on the lakefront, there's a nice little Jane Addams Park right near the Navy Pier, which I often go to visit and think about her greatness. And she received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. There were many other women who were involved in the peace movement at that time. Jessie Wallace Hugen was a radical pacifist and socialist from the early years of the 20th century, wrote an important book on the politics and history of socialism. And she was one who helped to found the War Resisters League in the United States, which was the affiliate of War Resisters International, which emerged in 1921. Hugen was also involved in the Anti-Enlistment League during the war and afterwards, and really played an important role. So throughout this period, and then all through the 20s and into the 1930s, there was a very strong movement towards pacifism. An incredible, widespread cultural, political, social consciousness emerged as people began to really think about and absorb the horror of that war and the millions who were slaughtered for what was apparently nothing. And so a very significant pacifist movement emerged. In the UK, there was the Peace Pledge Union in the 1930s. Pastor Dick Shepherd was a key leader in that movement, and more than 136,000 young men in England and UK signed pledges that they would not serve in any war for the king or for any purpose. There was, of course, the Oxford debates that went on through the 30s, where many university students and professors debated policies of pacifism, and again vowed that they would never participate in war again. So during this period, there was this very strong sense of revulsion against war. This figure here is with a name that we're not familiar with, but I'm sure you recognize that the man known as Nguyen Ai Quoc in 1921 became Ho Chi Minh. And I put his image up because he, along with others from nationalist movements around the world, movements against colonialism and imperialism, came to the Versailles Conference in 1919 and 1920 and pleaded for the national rights of their peoples. You remember Woodrow Wilson talked about the right of self-determination of all people. But of course, the Versailles Conference was, while it was about ending the war, it was also about a victor's peace, an imposition of draconian conditions on Germany, blaming the war entirely on Germany, and very importantly, protecting the positions of empire and indeed expanding the positions of empire that the victor states were able to control throughout the world. And Ho Chi Minh, like so many others who came to Versailles, were ignored. Their demands for the right of self-determination, for national rights, were completely rejected. And the impulse for empire and for maintaining military control over the empire was a dominant, regressive, pro-fascist, I would say, political impulse through the 20s and 30s that played a role in the rise of fascism and the onset of World War II. And so much of the effort to try to prevent war and disarm was blocked by those in the governments who wanted to protect their empires. While we're beyond the European context, I think any discussion of peace and pacifism in this period of history has to acknowledge the role of Gandhi emerging in India, of course, around the national issue, and fighting entirely with means of nonviolent resistance. And Gandhi, I think, is the one who, more than any other person in history, took the idea of non-cooperation, of civil disobedience, of the defiance of authority, the willingness to sacrifice and suffer rather than accept injustice and rather than causing harm to another. This idea, he turned it into a mass tool of social resistance that, of course, played a significant role in changing the tide of history in India, bringing freedom by 1947. And as we say, Gandhi was able to bring down the British Raj without ever firing a shot, entirely through the power of nonviolent resistance and through social organizing and movement. So I think Gandhi's contributions are important and need to be acknowledged as well. And of course, the Gandhian methodology of civil resistance has been adopted in many parts of the world. In the US, it was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. who developed these principles and applied it to the battle against segregation in the US South. And today, with so many movements in so many parts of the world, almost all of them adopting methods of civil resistance, of nonviolent action that owe a lot to the tradition and the principles of social change and political transformation that Gandhi introduced into the world. Going back to the period of the pacifist era of the 1930s, Albert Einstein was a key figure at that time, still living in Europe, of course, an acclaimed scientist, and his commitment to pacifism and publicly calling for young men to refuse to serve in the military had an electrifying effect on public opinion and really helped to popularize the movement of pacifism during that era. Although Einstein later changed his views, and as you know, when the Nazis took power in Germany, he fled, and then also began to call for preparing for the possibility of having to resist Hitlerism through armed means. Disarmament became a major campaign during this period in the interwar era. In the 19th century peace movements, disarmament was not a major issue, generally speaking. But after the horrors of World War I, after the clear and horrific role that was played by the arms industry in promoting war, in Europe especially, and in the United States prior to 1914, people began to recognize that wars were caused in part by these arms buildups, by the economic self-interest of the war profiteers. At the time, they were called the merchants of death. And it's a good phrase, and it's proper. In the United States, there was a major set of committee hearings in the Congress, the so-called Nye Committee. Joseph Nye was the chair of that committee, and it brought powerful evidence showing the conspiracy of arms industries across borders, even among warring states, to work together to foment bellicosity and war fever in their countries so that they could get greater contracts. So there was a powerful revulsion against the merchants of death during this period as against war itself. And this led, through popular pressure, to the great naval disarmament treaties and conferences that took place first in Washington in 1922 and then in London in 1930. And these agreements were significant in establishing limits on the major capital ships in the participating states, UK, France, Germany, Japan, others. And it played an important role in restraining the arms race and the arms buildup. A lot of conventional historians have sort of mocked these disarmament treaties as meaningless and ineffective, but they were effective and they did help to restrain military buildups for a while. And then in 1932, there was the attempt to have a broader general disarmament conference, again, an initiative of peace movements. This image shows just one of the delegations of women who came to play a role in supporting and encouraging the disarmament conference. They claim there were 6 million signatures sitting on their truck there. In total, there were an estimated 12 million signatures that were brought to the disarmament conference to try to encourage the powers to achieve broader disarmament. But of course, we know historically that they were unsuccessful, especially with the rise of fascist governments in Germany and in Japan and Italy. The disarmament conference collapsed. And with it, the League of Nations. Many peace activists had hoped that the League of Nations would serve as a vehicle, an international organization for settling conflicts peacefully. But the League was part of the imperialist sellout, if you will, at the Versailles Conference. And many peace activists, especially radical pacifists and socialists and others, were highly critical of the League of Nations for good reason. And it failed fundamentally in preventing World War II, of course. Although it's helped to settle some disputes in the world up until that time period and could have been saved, but its fundamental architecture was flawed and there were many reasons why it ultimately was unable to succeed. There's a big movement of internationalism that developed in this period that was reflected partly in the League, but that continued on beyond it. And some of you may know this recent book by these two scholars at Yale University. It's a great read, actually. It's fun. And of course, it's pretty heavy on international law, but it does help us to understand that the Paris Peace Pact of 1928, the Kellogg-Briand Agreement that was signed by world governments at that time, was a pledge to avoid going to war. Nations agreed to prohibit the use of war as a tool of international statecraft. And this was profoundly significant at the time because up until then, actually, war was still considered a normal instrument of state policy. If there's a dispute with a neighbor, it was perfectly legal under international law to just send your army or your navy to attack. But under the Paris Pact, nations agreed to outlaw war, and this movement was called outlawry. And many joined in this campaign. Now, of course, here again, the imperialist and colonial interests of the major powers got in the way, because when England and France and other countries signed the Paris Peace Pact, they included a clause of an exception for policing the colonies, as they said. And so they always reserved the right to use force against native peoples to suppress nationalist movements in India and many other places, as of course they did much during that period of history. But this innovation, this prohibition, general prohibition against war as an instrument of statecraft, was important and continued through the end of World War II. And here the founding of the United Nations in San Francisco in the spring of 1945. The UN Charter includes in Article 2 a prohibition against the use of war. Nations are prohibited from using force against another state, with only two exceptions. One was the right of self-defense. If you're being attacked, nations were considered to have the right to fight back. And then the other exception was that through the authorization of the United Nations Security Council. And this was an attempt to try to make sure that any aggression that might arise in the world would be addressed through international mechanisms rather than through alliances of states or through individual nation states. And still today, this is the standard of international law. Few in the United States know this or follow it for sure. And in many countries, people fail to recognize that war as an instrument of policy is prohibited. And it's interesting, even on the self-defense provision that's in the UN Charter, it says states may act in self-defense, but they're under obligation to bring that to the Security Council for a collective security response. That's unfortunately never been done, but it is the standard of international law and is one of the legacies of the peace movements of the 1920s and 30s and of the broad internationalist movement that emerged in history at that time. We come today then to the final part of my presentation on disarmament and confronting the atomic bomb. It's one of the tragic ironies of history that Einstein, the great pacifist, worried about the rise of Hitler in the late 1930s, urged the US to move ahead with a program to develop atomic weapons. And many atomic scientists who, like Einstein, were refugees of fascism from Europe, joined in this effort to build a bomb as a way of trying to deter the horror of a possible Nazi bomb. Because many of the colleagues of Einstein, and this is Leo Szilard to your right as you're looking at it, also one of the leading atomic scientists, they were genuinely concerned about the possibility of the Nazis getting the bomb. But of course, as the war progressed, they realized that the war had been won without any necessity of using the atomic bomb. The United States used the bombs anyway in August of 1945, but history shows that the Japanese were ready to surrender before that. The bombing was not necessary to end the war. And many of the atomic scientists before then realized that it was necessary to try to stop the US from proceeding to drop the bomb or to develop nuclear weapons, to stop an atomic arms race. And so Einstein spent the last years of his life, in a way, trying to undo the legacy of his actions there in the 1930s to encourage the US to develop the bomb. So he and Szilard and Rabinowitz and many other atomic scientists put together the first parts of the nuclear disarmament movement, the first wave of nuclear disarmament movements. In my other works, I've talked about the disarmament movement as having had three major waves. The first was when the scientists organized in the late 40s. The second was in the late 50s and 60s, when nuclear testing in the atmosphere caused a global health crisis and brought the horror of nuclear testing to people's consciousness. And that was the time when groups like CND in the UK, SANE in the US, Women's Strike for Peace, and other disarmament organizations emerged. And all of them are still alive in various forms in some new organizations. Like in the US, it's Peace Action rather than SANE. But in this first phase, the scientists organized and tried to put together proposals for the control of atomic energy and brought these proposals to the United Nations. Few people realize that the very first resolution adopted by the United Nations in 1946, when it met, I think it was in London, called for a system of international control of atomic energy and the elimination of all means of developing nuclear weapons in all countries. And that was partly as a result of the initiative of Einstein and Szilard and David Lilienthal and others to try to prevent the proliferation of weapons in an arms race. But as we know, of course, that idea did not go very far, and the arms race took off. And the peace movement entered a very dark period in the late 40s and early 50s as repression, somewhat parallel to what was experienced in 1919 and 20 and 21 after World War I, a right-wing turn politically, the rise of neo-fascist thinking that was reflected in the US in the McCarthy hearings and other efforts to suppress dissent and the voice of peace movements. But the movements, of course, have since revived. And just to close, I would say that when we think of the ups and downs of the peace movements through history, now through 2 centuries, as we've talked about here, better part of 2 centuries, I think we can say with confidence that many of the most important innovations in international relations of the last century or more have come through initiatives of the peace movements. As I mentioned, internationalism, the call for international organizations to settle differences peacefully. There's a tradition of that going back to the 17th century among peace philosophers and peace advocates. And of course, that continued through the 19th century and especially in the 20th century. Many of the ideas for what became the United Nations emerged among peace scholars, among those internationalists that are talked about in the book that I mentioned. So that idea, which is so critical to the chances for international security and prevention of war, has been an initiative, and it remains important today. The UN today is weakened, unfortunately. The United States and other countries have disdained the UN and refused to cooperate with it. But there is still a very broad network of international organizations. Today we have complex internationalism or multilateralism. And many of us continue to advocate for renewing and strengthening and reviving the mission and the powers in the UN Charter that are given to the UN organization. So that's one major contribution to history. The second is the outlawing of war, the prohibition against war. Of course, nations violate these principles all the time. But as in civil society, there are violations of the laws against murder, but it's important that we have these laws. And the hope is that over time it creates a pacifying, a controlling influence on violence in society. And of course, there's a big debate on whether the incidence of war has declined or not. in history with the work of Steven Pinker and others. But what we can say is that in international law, there is a prohibition against war, and that many states do try to follow it. I think the European Union, the charters of the UN, of the EU are partly based on this concept of settling differences without the use of military force. So that's an important contribution. And the third is the movement for disarmament, a recognition that the activists of the early 20th century were right to emphasize the pernicious influence of the arms industry, the merchants of death. And that influence remains very much alive today in the US especially. We see with so many arms contractors feeding at the trough of public finances and taxes to build unnecessary weapons that end up making it more convenient and easier for political leaders to engage in wars. And it's necessary for us to continue the disarmament movements. Groups like the Atomic Scientists remain involved. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which Einstein helped to create back in 1947 and 48, continues to publish. And maybe I'll end with one more shameless self-promotion. I have a short piece in the current issue of the Bulletin online. So, and it's actually a history lesson. So if you're interested, take a look at it, and I offer a little history lesson to some of the folks in the Trump administration. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for this impressive presentation. Though you didn't have 100 years to summarize, it was a very tense time. Thank you very much, very impressive. I'm just looking at my notes and I have Peace Pledge movement, which it's brilliant. The idea is brilliant. You managed to combine Gandhi and Einstein in your presentation. I'm in favor of calling merchants of death even today. Everyone involved and having economic interest and profits of war. So we'll keep that. And thank you very much for the last 3 points, for summarizing them. We should work on all the 3 of them, especially of the enforcement of international law. It's not that bad what you think it is. It's just the enforcement we have to work on it. So I would now like, looking at the time, open the floor to the discussion and to questions from you. I just saw that there are 2 comments in the chat. Deborah Walker just added that Jane Addams was also a key leader in the maternal and child health, leading to many reforms in public health in the US. And Colin Archer, IPB, was active during this period with ups and downs. Perhaps Guido could say a bit about that. I'm not sure if this is the question. So I'm opening now the floor to the questions to those who raised their hands. Marlene? So Marlene, please, the floor is yours.
This was a comment for the earlier part of the discussion, the first presentation, and there were some comments about the relationship of the early reformers to workers. And as I understand it, the reformers in Britain particularly were part of a movement, a very loose movement, of the newly arrived industrialists and merchants and financiers of the early stages of the Industrial Revolution to create a class identity for themselves that stood in contrast, as they saw it, to the moral licentiousness and history of violence of the aristocracy on the one hand, and also of the workers on the other hand. So it seems that, I don't know for sure about this, but I think they would have been fully in support of a police force, for example, to discipline the workers. So there's really no reality of cross-class attempts during that early period. That has to wait until later. So.
Thank you. So this is a question to Guido?
No, it was just a comment.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking for the raised hands. Yeah, in the chat, Yuri asks, role of bankers in anti-war, pro-war movements. As I remember, Morgan bankers allegedly nudged Wilson to intervene in World War I.
Yeah, just to comment on that, that's true. Certainly, there was the power of industry, had to be backed up by the finance sector. And when the NIE committee hearings were held, many of these connections in the corporate and industrial world were identified. And so there was a blanket condemnation of the industrial sector and of the industries for creating the political atmosphere that led to World War I, for sure.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Rainer, I see your hand.
You know, David, I have a short comment and then a question. My comment is, please don't have illusions in the European Union. The European Union is more and more becoming also a militaristic superpower. You know, and the militarization of the European Union is one of the most long paths of the last years, above all after Brexit. That is the comment, and my question is, you know, I was also reading about peace history, and one of the white places where quite no one is saying something is the question, what was the peace movement doing before the Second World War happened? In this period, 38, killing Czech Republic by the fascists, Munich Agreement, till to the start of the Second World War, including the so-called Ribbentrop-Molotov agreement. What were the actions and activities of the peace movement at that time?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there were those who were the, absolute pacifists who remained committed to their belief and continued to resist the rise of armaments and the war threats that were emerging. And there was a principal position that said we oppose Hitlerism and fascism, but we also oppose war. And there were some, as I say, who maintained that position. But it became more difficult to sustain broader mass support as the 30s went on. And a couple of things would account for that. There were many in more of the socialist or labor parts of movements who probably did not share an absolute pacifist belief and increasingly came to see the need for confronting fascism through armed struggle. So of course there was a big rallying of support for the Spanish Republic in '36 and a sense in other crises that emerged during that time that ultimately it would require a military struggle. So there was that thrust, that tendency that existed within the broader peace movement, not so much among the absolute pacifist community, but among the broader peace community. And then another thing that happened, at least in the US, I'm less aware in Europe, but certainly in the US, there was a debate about whether the US should enter the war, and some parts of the liberal left labor communities, as I mentioned, were advocating for entering the war and fighting against fascism, defending England and supposed democracy. But there was also in the US the far right pro-fascist movements that included elements of white supremacy, the same groups that had been applying violence and pressure against African Americans in the United States. So a big movement emerged to keep America out of the war that was largely dominated by these very right-wing groups. And one of the big coalitions was around the group America First. And what this came to mean was, well, we're not so uncomfortable with the Nazis. They hate the communists. and we do too. So there was that kind of mentality. So it became very difficult for those in the pacifist or peace movement who wanted to speak against the war to do so publicly without seeing themselves as associated with these proto-fascist tendencies. So it was a very difficult time for the peace movements. And just one last thought is, you'll recall that when Trump came into office, he used that phrase, America first. And those of us who know a little bit about that history would cringe and wonder whether he was just ignorant or whether maybe he was really recalling that same kind of politics. And sadly, it may be that it was more the latter, that same thinking about supporting fascist military strongmen is a politics that emerged at that time and unfortunately still alive today.
Thank you very much. I would just like to add the comment of Colin. In early 1939, IPB was pushing for another international peace conference.
Yes, thank you for that.
The next question is Ariel.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting and so difficult to say so much in such a short time. I would like to ask to you two questions related to now, in fact. One is, do you feel similarities in the time that we live now with some other periods in history? Some people say today looks a bit like it was just before the Second World War, or even they refer to the First World War. So I would like very much to have your opinion. And my second question would be on the characteristic of the peace movement of now compared to what it has been in history. Do you see new branches? Do you see new ways of acting for peace, or is it really on the same line that it has always been? Thank you very much.
Yeah, very difficult questions. Maybe I could ask Guido to join in on responding. Yes, well, I think there are some similarities to previous pre-war periods, World War II, that are worrisome. Certainly the failure of disarmament in 1932 paved the way for Hitler's rearmament, and Japan was already rearming, and of course the Western countries and Russia. And with today we see a partial failure of disarmament and arms control through the attacks on all these different agreements from the Trump administration. So literally we've seen all of the existing agreements around arms control and nuclear arms reduction have been undermined by this administration. And the last agreement is the New START treaty between the US and Russia, and it's not looking very good for that agreement either. So this is always a dangerous process. It frees up states to rely more and more on weapons per se. And also one of the things that's less recognized in arms control and disarmament agreements is that they provide verification mechanisms. They provide means by which the parties are in communication with one another. And they have to bring problems to the table for joint deliberation and hopefully solutions. And that's a critical aspect of international relations generally that can be a break on the tendencies towards war. They also provide an objective standard of information, so states can know what the other state has, and they'll be less likely to miscalculate, etc. So the breakdown of arms control and disarmament is worrisome. And as I mentioned also, this Trumpian politics, if I may say, of embracing authoritarian neo-fascist leaders, of using the military, trying to use the military in the US to control demonstrators, These are very dangerous trends. Thankfully, there's been a strong pushback, and this might be an answer to your second question. There are peace movements still active in the US, pushing to prevent the US from renewing wars in the Middle East, from sending troops to Syria or other countries, and has been active in trying to save the Iran nuclear deal or save some of the current arms control agreements. But it's a movement that is, I would call, intersectional and more multi-issue oriented. And we move in the peace movement with the broad issues of our time. So for example, the climate change movement has the broader consciousness and support of young people today and of many people around the world. And you'll find many people from the peace and disarmament movements playing an active role in that movement because it's about the same goal of saving our planet. And today, in the movement against racial abuse and police violence, again, there's a lot of similarities. The mentality of racism and white supremacy has so often been part of the thinking that leads to war and violence. And there's also the need to build a broader, truly intersectional movement in the United States. And one of the wonderful things about what we've seen over these last 2 weeks is that you have a movement of white people working to support Black Lives Matter and speaking against racial injustice and police violence directed against people of color. That's significant. And I pray and hope that it'll be sustained, and it may create the possibility of a truly united, broad movement for social justice and for reduction of violence in our country. And to me, that is a peace movement. It may not always be focused on things like New START treaties, but it's a broad movement for trying to achieve justice and peace. Guido, any further thoughts on that?
Guido, would you like to add something on that?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
It's Philip.
Hello, Philip. You would like to ask a question?
Am I jumping?
Yeah,
I hope I'm not jumping in the queue.
You can ask your question.
Okay. Well, I want to thank both the speakers, Guido and David, for all of this background. It's been really absorbing and interesting. I want to test both of your reactions to this. You said, David, that there was a very strong pushback to the militarization or the use of the military in public protest. And I'm wondering from you, your advice to the peace movement now would be, what should we be saying at this moment other than saying that this is wrong? I think we have a very good chance. I know Jerome from the ITUC, the Global Labour Movement, is on the line. I think this is the moment for us all worldwide to speak out against the militarization of our police and the military intervention into our democratic space.
Yeah.
And just to get your reaction, yesterday, Stoltenberg, the chief of NATO, was talking about his plan for NATO for 2030. And this is what he said. And maybe you can give some historical kind of context to this. He said, NATO 2030 is about how we adapt to the new normal, i.e. the state of the world that we're in. And he says, to do this, we must stay strong militarily, be more united politically, and take a broader approach globally. And then he went on to say, in a different nuance, was basically to say, NATO must become more political and use a broader range of tools, military and non-military, economic and diplomatic. And he goes on to say that we should use our new political role to defend the global rules and institutions that have kept us safe for decades. I mean, from your perspective, where do you situate those kind of comments?
Right. Well, I think you're right to identify this pushback against the militarization of the police as a very important part of the current movement. It's really right at the front and center of the demands that are coming out of Black Lives Matter and the many different movements. If you go to these protests, there are many signs, handmade signs and others, and demilitarize the police, defund the police. These kinds of signs are everywhere. And I think it's a very good sign. And coupled with that, of course, is the need for a radical change in the tactics and practices of the police, away from aggressive attacks against communities, away from even carrying weapons, in my view, and trying to be more of a service to the communities rather than a force that's waging war on the communities and on crime in the communities. So I think we've got a possibility of making some progress on this to prevent further militarization, to sell off or junk all of this military equipment that they have now, and to, if not reduce funding. I know for the US, reducing funding is going to be hard politically, but at least we can say, let's rechannel the funding into programs in the communities that address the underlying social issues that we know cause crime and provide better housing and education, et cetera, for people who've been left behind in marginalized neighborhoods and communities. So I think staying on this drive, pushing against militarization. You know, it's interesting, just a footnote on this, the whole drive towards building up the police in the United States, in my memory, I haven't really researched this, came about as a result of the civil rights movement and the anti-war movements of the 60s and the Nixon policy of so-called law and order.
Yeah.
The uprisings that were shaking many American cities at that time, and the very widespread protests against the war created this politics of reaction that Nixon capitalized upon and used. And since then, we've seen this growth of police forces, growth of a more militarized mentality and set of practices and tools. So I would definitely agree on pushing back on that. And with regard to NATO, well, I mean, for a long time, many of us have felt that NATO has long since outlived its usefulness. The expansion of NATO in the 1990s was a huge historical mistake that set back international politics and basically forfeited the opportunity that emerged from the end of the Cold War for real cooperation between East and West. So the NATO, in my view, should plan on going out of business entirely and focusing on the underlying social, political, and other conditions that lead to violence is fine, but it's not the mission of a military organization. It's a mission of civilian agencies, of peace builders like ourselves, for development, humanitarian assistance, and human rights.
Okay, if I may add, I think what Stoltenberg is talking of is a secularization of all problems, of global problems, climate change, of political problems. And it reminds me historically, it reminds me of the Prussian militarism, but in a very smart way, not this brute Prussian militarism just dominating political life in Imperial Germany, but prevailing, being the instrument and the people who decide what are the problems and how to solve them. I think countering it, we have to make it very clear that military thinking is a limited thinking. Military people talk of enemies. Nowadays we know, especially for example now in the COVID pandemic, we know we have to work together. We have some people, some governments which behave in a wrong way, but they are not enemies, they are opponents. It is totally a difference. And I think what we have to stress is, it's the same what David said, I say it in other words, the military is not capable of dealing with those things. The military has a kind of restricted approaching problems. It does it in a very ineffective and very expensive way. This has been shown throughout history since more than 100 or 200 years now. And we should make it clear that what we need is first rechanneling or rechanneling of funds. And the second thing is that we need to approach those things in a way which means we try to work together. If we have people who put up obstacles, yes, we will fight them, but not as an enemy, but as opponents.
Yeah, I want to thank you both for these comments, because Stoltenberg yesterday said we also need to use NATO more politically.
Yeah. I got it.
So, for me, this is absolutely stunning. Where in my union life we were on the barricades, and others, all of us, against dictatorship, the generals running the show, and we know that they are incapable of fulfilling the role that they pretend that they can play. Now, NATO has brought together 10 wise heads to advise them about how they can become more political and how they can play a stronger political role in the public domain. And I think that on our side, we have to have the response. Now, we've been looking at the Olof Palme report from 1982. It's the 40th anniversary coming up. We've been talking to the Olof Palme Institute, and they're very much in favor of trying to rekindle interest once again, and in fact get another process underway where we look once again at what common security looks like in the current context. And we say this because we can't let this debate be dominated by the generals and the colonels and the military process. And NATO are trying to occupy this political ground, which we must deny them in an intellectual sense, in an emotional sense, and also in a public awakening sense. And I think this is, for this, I suppose every generation of the peace movement has its challenges to face. And I know we talked about our ups and downs, but we're still here. We are still here. And we see the faces that we see on the streets and the barricades in the United States, and everywhere today there's demonstrations worldwide. There's a new generation out there that is eager to change things as they are. So I hope that this can give us a new burst of adrenaline, because we're certainly not short of ideas. And I was very pleased when you gave us all that kind of sense of hope, when you talked about what the peace movement has achieved over the years, when in times of this kind of grayness and darkness out there, we can lose sight of this. So I know I'm rambling a bit, but I feel this political challenge is very significant. What worries me is, I know George Floyd said he could not breathe. And I know for a fact that they're out for us. They're out for civil society, that they're out for the labor movement. I know Hitler on May the 2nd, how did he extinguish the protest voice in Germany? He killed, arrested, banned, and murdered. And when I look around at the extent to which people, human rights defenders, people who speak up, union organizers, we can't breathe, because the space for us to breathe is being taken from us. So I hope that when Mr. Stoltenberg talks about getting more political oxygen, that's one oxygen that we have to deny them, and to awaken people to the implications of what we're talking about. And I think what you both said is very helpful for us in framing these views and framing a response which will come.
Yeah, just to thank you, Philip, for that. I agree completely. And if there is some, I just sent you a chat, but if there is some effort to create an alternative to this NATO goal and to revive bodies like the Common Security Commission, I think it would be valuable. And one of the things that we can do nowadays is to really make these kinds of movements truly global in terms of their intersectionality, to include our colleagues in the Black Lives Movement in the US, the Latino communities and others. Worldwide, the mobilization of peoples is spreading, and it's spreading among people in the developing world especially, demanding their rights. And security in this time has to be global. It has to be planetary and ecological as well. And to define a politics of security in the new world that we live in today, and now public health, of course, being such a critical factor, and trying to learn the lesson of why some states manage to weather the virus better than others, and what are the factors that determine how well states can protect the public health of their people. These are all tied together now around a common conception of human well-being, human security for the future.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay, thank you,
to
Amela,
all
for
of
giving me
you.
the floor. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Philip, for the questions, and thank you also for describing our struggle. But I would like to pick up your line. We are still here, and I'm sure we won't leave until we achieve our goals. Let's see how long it takes. Looking at the time, closing now the discussion part, I would like to thank our speakers, everyone involved and everyone participated. I know that a few already left, but thanks to everyone for joining, for listening, for being a part of this. Don't forget that there is a second part of this history session next week with Rainer Braun and Colin Archer. You saw Colin's comments in the chat, and you can see that he also mentioned that more details on IPB history can be found on our website, so please have a look at that one too. And before I close, I can't help but notice, Ariel, your cat looked adorable. This made my day. Thank you, everyone. And I hope to see all of you in the next session. Bye.
It was a peace cat.
Yes.
Certainly, most certainly.
That's our peace.
Great stuff. Thank you, David. Thank you, Guido. Thanks for all the hard work that you put into this. We really appreciate what you've done. Thank you.